and be looking at Psalm 23. Living the life of Psalm 23. A life of walking through. Verse 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Fourth verse marks the halfway point of the psalm. There is a transition. There's really a couple of transitions that take place here in this fourth psalm and continues through verse 5. By transition, of course, we mean moving from one place to another, changing from one place or one state to another, not United States, but state conditions. Life is full, of course, of transitions. In the first 3 verses, he talks about lying down in green pastures and being led by the still waters, having his soul restored, being led in the paths of righteousness. And he moves from there to the valley of the shadow of death. But what's important here is I walk through. I walk through. It's not a place where we stay. It's never intended that we stay there. This life is what makes up our traveling days, and that is conveyed by these words, I walk through. That is, I walk into and out of. I walk into the valley of the shadow of death, and I walk out of the valley of the shadow of death. As I walk into the valley of the shadow of death, I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death. So, this is just our passing through at times. We're referred to as strangers and pilgrims in Hebrews 11. A stranger, of course, is a foreigner, and a pilgrim is one who's just passing through, just traveling through for a little time. As strangers and pilgrims, we're not to allow ourselves to be weighted down. We have a destination. And again, it's just like when we go on a trip. You have a destination point. Everything else, you're just passing through to get to that destination. You don't want any distractions as you go along the way. And so it is. For the child of God, we ought to not be distracted in our pilgrimage. That is, anything that would slow us down, anything that would distract our attention, get our eye off of where we're headed. If you listen to most of God's people talk, it sounds like this is their permanent home. They're not just traveling through. They've dug deep roots, and their life is very much rooted to this world. But again, our life in the world is to be the walking through place. Beyond that, we come to verse 6, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's our dwelling place. But until then, we are walking through. That is, we're on our way. We're on our way to where we're headed. That is, a house not made with hands, eternal in heavens. That's where we're headed. Headed toward our inheritance. Headed toward that which is far better. So as we walk through, we must always remember where we're headed. Where we're headed. And that's what we have our sights upon. Notice in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. We must remember this as we walk through. Verse 17 and 18. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Okay, all affliction is for a moment. And it's light. Doesn't matter what it is. It's light in comparison. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us. Doesn't work against us. It works for us. A far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And that's what makes it light when you compare the two. You compare earthly affliction. Again, it doesn't matter what it is. You compare earthly affliction to the eternal weight of glory, and affliction is light. It doesn't compare to what awaits us. And so it is here in Psalm 23, to dwell in the house of the Lord far, far exceeds the valley of the shadow of death. In verse 18, while we look not at the things which are seen. Okay, what are the things that are seen? Our affliction. We're not to dwell in that. That's not where our mind is to dwell. That's not our focus. Because that's very temporary. It's just for a moment. It's just going to be a moment. But at the things which are not seen, which is the far more exceeding weight of glory. For the things which are seen, again, here in the strict context, affliction, it applies to everything that is seen, are temporal. They're temporary. They're temporary. How temporary? Just for a moment. In comparison to eternity. But the things which are not seen are eternal. And then he goes on in chapter 5. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle, referring to our physical body, which is the house of the soul. If our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, completely dissolved, we have a building of God. So that makes the dissolving very light compared to what we have. And house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For this we groan earnestly. Now, many of God's people, they don't really groan earnestly for heaven. They groan earnestly for more things of the earth, but they're not really groaning earnestly for the things of heaven. That's a problem. That's a real problem. And desiring to be clothed with the house which is from heaven, that is desiring glorification. So everything in this life is just walking through. Doesn't matter what it is in this life. It can be affliction, it can be pleasure. Doesn't matter. It's temporary, and we're just walking through. We're just passing through. And we must always remember that. In verse 8, chapter 5, we are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. We're passing through this life. But if our heart is right, we'd rather not be here. We have to use what God has given us here and use every opportunity that God gives us here. We're to serve Him here. But the truth be said, if we were given our choice, we'd rather be in heaven. And I'm not so sure that's true of a lot of people. So we have to remember this is the passing through stage. Have to remember where we're headed. That changes everything. That changes how we view everything in life. It all changes. Notice in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 16. Hebrews 11, verse 16. It's talking about these pilgrims. But now they desire, that is now, right now in this life, they desire a better country. It's talking about heaven. That is in heavenly. So he explains it. Not just a better country physically, not just that the United States would get better, but this isn't home. This isn't where our citizenship is. Our citizenship is in heaven. We're just passing through. And again, I'm afraid a lot of people don't get that. They never have gotten it, and probably never will. We're just passing through. Just like when you're on a trip, you just pass through a town. That's all we're doing here. We're just passing through. Things happen as we pass through. We experience things, but we're just passing through. We're not staying here. That is a heavenly, wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. In the context, a heavenly city. So remember, we're just passing through. Now, if we go back to Psalm 23, verse 4, the verse opens with that word, yea. Yea. When you see that word, the tone has changed, for one. So that's one of the transitions here. I mean, the tone has been wonderful in the first 3 verses. There's a change in tone. And it's not for the bad. It's for the good. Yea. The word means more than this. More than this. Or not only so, but. So you could read the first 3 verses. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. But more than this, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And he goes on, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Yea, more than this. I mean, that's pretty good. Verses 1 and 2. But yea, more than this. And then he gets to verse 3, he restoreth my soul, he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea. Yea. It's almost like an exclamation point. Yea. It is a word that is used, again, it means more than this, not only so, but it's a word used to introduce something even more explicit, more emphatic. Now, I believe verses 1 through 3 are pretty emphatic. But what he states here in verse 4 is even more emphatic. And it brings emphasis to what was stated in verses 1 through 3. So the word yea is used to emphasize. It emphasizes verses 1 through 3. It's stronger language. Yea. So there's a transition in tone. So yea, and then notice the next word, though. Yea, more than this, not only so, though. The word though means despite the fact. Despite the fact. It's one of my favorite words in the Bible, though. Follow that through sometime. Though. It means however, or nevertheless. So you have the truths stated in verses 1 through 3. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. Yea, though. Though is indicative of a possibility of change. Nothing changes in verses 1 through 3. That's not where the change is. The change is in the setting. He's now in the valley of the shadow of death. But despite that, everything that is said in verses 1 through 3 is still so. Doesn't change. Yea, though. Those words ought to be our life. Yea, though. Yea, though. You take the truths that we know and the possibilities of what can happen to us, and it ought to be yea, though. Even though that is possible, doesn't change anything in verses 1 through 3. Doesn't change who the Lord is. So you take those two words, yea, though, they're words of confidence. They're words of confidence in the Lord. They are words of assurance in the Lord. You can put whatever you want on the other side of though. But these are words of confidence. Though this happened, the Lord's still my shepherd, and I will not lack, etc. They're words of faith. They're words of hope and joy. They are words of gratitude. Yea, though. They are words of wonder and amazement. And again, that it should be our lives. Notice in Psalm 46, Psalm 46, verses 2 and 3. Therefore, because of what is said in verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, will not we fear, and here it is, though. Possibility that exists. May not happen, but it may happen. Though the earth be removed. That's pretty serious. Though the earth be removed. And though, there's a second though, the mountains be carried in the midst of the sea. This is pretty drastic stuff. And then there's a third one. Though the waters thereof, that is of the sea, roar and be troubled. And then a fourth, though the mountains shake with fear. He says all of these things could happen. We can't control that. But in spite of these things happening, God is our refuge. God is our strength. God is a very present help in trouble. Yea, though. Then you go down to verse 4. There is a river, the streams whereof make glad the city of God. That's true no matter what happens. That's true no matter what follows though. We read in verse 5, God is. That's true no matter what. No matter what though What follows though? That's true. Verse 7, the Lord of hosts is. The God of Jacob is. And then you drop down to verse 11, the same thing. The Lord of hosts is. The God of Jacob is. Whatever you put on the other side of though, those things are still true. And that's what David is saying here in Psalm 23:4. Yea, though. Usually what follows though is something terrible. What we would consider terrible. Notice in Ezekiel 11, my favorite verse, Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 16. Ezekiel 11, verse 16. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, although, that's the same as though, although I have cast them far off among the heathen, and although I have scattered them abroad the countries, yet will I be. And that's true. Whatever follows though, yet will I be. Whatever changes we experience, yet will I be. So when the psalmist says, yea, though, they're words of faith. They're words of assurance. And really, Psalm 23:4, yea, though, is the direct result of the Lord is my shepherd. And everything else in verses 2 and 3 is the result of the Lord being our shepherd. So that's the foundation. The Lord is my shepherd. And because of that, we can say, yea, though. Yea, though. Terrible things may happen. A lot of things may happen that we would never choose to happen. We don't want to happen. But they still happen. But God's people should always be able to say, yea, though. Yea, though. So all through the Psalm, Psalm 23, there's, as you read the Psalm, there seems to be a feeling of growing excitement. And it just hits its climax in verse 6. But everything seems to be growing in excitement, in wonder and confidence. That ought to be our life. That ought to be our life. Our lives ought to be growing in excitement, wonder, and confidence. Even as you look around today at how terrible things are, God's people ought to be getting excited because we're getting close. And God's people, there ought to be a feeling of excitement. But that's not what you sense around God's people. You sense fear and chaos, which is indicative of the way they've been living their lives. It shouldn't be that way. So the Psalm seems to be growing in excitement and wonder. In verses 4 and 5, there's a transition in vividness. He gets more specific in verses 4 and 5. The language is more graphic. Not that it's not graphic in verses 1 through 3, but it's even more so in verses 4 and 5. So the excitement, the wonder of the Lord as shepherd is growing. And that leads to here in verse 4, yea, though. Yea, though. Again, it's the knowledge that the Lord as our shepherd is bigger than anything else. Whatever follows though, the Lord is my shepherd, it's bigger than whatever though consists of. And that leads to the psalmist saying, yea, though. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So David speaks of a valley, that which is between the mountain peaks. And the name of the valley is the valley of the shadow of death. This valley has the shadow of death, which means there has to be, if there's a shadow, there has to be light. This valley has the outline of death. It has the shape of death. The valley of death's shadow. Now that language, of course, there's not a place literally called the valley of the shadow of death. That's metaphorical. It's used to teach us a lesson. I do not believe that it is limited to the actual experience of death. I do believe it includes that. And I do believe that those who die go through a valley of the shadow of death to one degree or another. But I don't believe we can limit it to that. It's included, but it's not limited to that. So the idea conveyed here is not a peaceful valley. Some valleys are very peaceful. Not all valleys are bad. And rather than being a peaceful valley, it's more of a narrow ravine. But the emphasis is, concerning this valley, is that it is the shadow of death. The shadow of death. So, what does that mean? Well, that phrase, valley of the shadow of death, this isn't the only place that it's used. Notice over in the book of Job. It's used in Job more than anywhere else. And what's Job about? Suffering. In Job chapter 10, verse 21, he says, "Before I go whence, I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and the shadow of death." The land of darkness and the shadow of death. One and the same. One and the same. Doesn't sound pleasant. Verse 22, a land of darkness has darkness itself, trying to describe the degree of darkness, and of the shadow of death, without any order, and where the light is as darkness, or even the light is dark. There's just a glimmer of light. And the psalmist says, yea, though I walk through. It's not, yea, though I get stuck in. Yea, though I walk through. That must always be the case, walking through, not sitting down in it, not wallowing in it, but walking through it. Sometimes we walk, the walk is slower than other times, but either way it's a progression. Job 24, verse 17. For the morning is to them even as the shadow of death. If one know them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. The terrors of the shadow of death. So this shadow of death is a fearful place. Yet the psalmist says, yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. It is a place of fear. But the child of God doesn't have to be afraid, because the Lord is my shepherd. Go on in Job 38 and verse 17. Job 38, verse 17. Have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Now there, I believe he's talking about death specifically. The doors of death. He's asking, do you understand? Do you understand the gates of death? Have they been opened to you? No. Death is a mystery. There's a lot of mystery about death. Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Then notice in Psalm 44, verses 18 and 19. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons, that's a place of fear, and covered us with the shadow of death. Psalm 107. Psalm 107. In verse 10. Such as sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, being bound in affliction and iron. That should not be us. We should not sit in the darkness in the shadow of death. Certainly should not be bound there. We're walking through. We're walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Verse 14, he brought them out of the darkness and the shadow of death, and break their bands in sunder. The truth is, every unsaved person, that's where they live. There's the shadow of death. In Jeremiah chapter 13. Jeremiah 13. Verses 15 through verse 17. Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for the Lord hath spoken. Give glory to the Lord your God before he cause darkness, and before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains. And while ye look for light, he turn it into the shadow of death, and make it gross darkness. But if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret places for your pride, and mine eyes shall weep sore and run down with tears, because the Lord's flock is carried away captive. So again, the shadow of death, it does include death, or the process of dying, but it's really just indicative of that which is gloomy, dangerous, mysterious, lonely, that which will very likely cause apprehension, trepidation. No one wants to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Causes dread and fear, but because the Lord is my shepherd, it is even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The psalmist is saying, I rise above that valley. So again, I believe the valley of the shadow of death is metaphorical. It tells us that as you come to this fourth verse of Psalm 23, it tells us that life involves change. Again, the very word though is indicative of change. Though is a word of possibility. It's possible that this happens. It's a word of transition. It is a word of change. Now, a shepherd in Israel would lead his flock to different pastures at various times of the year, and this was for the benefit of the sheep. The sheep in the heat of the summer would be in the higher regions where it was colder and cooler, and just the opposite in the winter. So with these transitions, the sheep had a need to travel through the valleys. But all along the way, the shepherd is leading the sheep. And not only that, the shepherd is providing the sheep. He's leading them through that valley to get them to the place where they need to be. And sometimes you have to go through the valley of the shadow of death. So all that is stated in verses 1 through 3 is true in verse 4. I believe as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we experience the Lord as our shepherd. And even though it is the valley of the shadow of death, I shall not want. I will not lack what I need in the valley of the shadow of death. And I believe even in the valley of the shadow of death, the Lord will cause us to lie down in green pastures. And He will lead us beside the still water. All this still takes place. But the problem is when many get in the valley of the shadow of death, they lose sight of everything in verses 1 through 3. And the only thing they see is death. That's all they see. But again, it's important that we remember, I'm walking through. I'm walking through. It's not permanent. Nothing in this life is. People act as if it is. Nothing in this life is permanent. Everything in this life is temporary. That's true of the good. That's true of the bad. Everything is temporary. Everything is subject to change. Solomon, of course, learned that lesson very well. Notice in Ecclesiastes, very familiar passage. In chapter 3, verse 1, there are 4 words that we want to notice. He says, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. 4 words. Thing. Thing. That's an action, an activity, an event. To everything there is a season. That is, a season is an appointed period of time. A season is a cycle. In this case, the season is the appointed period or cycle in which these things happen. He's describing life. And then we see the word time. There's an appointed moment in which these activities and events occur. And the appointed moment is only for a season. It's not forever. It's only for a season. And then you have the word purpose. That speaks of the intention of these things. The intention of circumstances. And it's comforting to know God has purpose. Nothing happens by chance. Nothing is random. God has a purpose in everything. Well, I need to know what the purpose is. If you need to know, God will tell you. But many times we don't need to know the purpose. All we need to know is He's in control of the purpose. And He has a purpose. And these things do not happen by accident. And then he goes on and he mentions different seasons. And it's the seasons of life. And there are 14 sets down through verse 8 or verse 9. 14 sets of opposites Not things that are similar. 14 sets of opposites. 14 sets of contrasts. 14 sets of extremes. These are not just gradual things. These are extremes. He mentions birth and death. That's life. There's birth, there's death. We experience the birth of loved ones, we experience the death of loved ones. Those who are born will die. There's birth, there's death. Quite a change. There is planting and plucking. Two opposites. There's a time to plant. There's a time to pluck. There's killing and healing. Demolishing and building. Weeping and laughing. Weeping may turn to laughing in a second. Laughing may turn to weeping in a second. Life is full of change. But for you and I, it should be, yea though. Yea though. Yea though. He mentions mourning and dancing, throwing away and gathering, embracing and withdrawing, gaining and losing, keeping and tossing away, tearing and sowing, silence and speaking, loving and hating, war and peace. And notice where it ends. Peace. And that's where it always ends for the child of God. That gets us to Psalm 23:6. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. For you and I, we just pass through this life. This life is subject to change. Everything in life changes. We're living proof of it. Every one of us, we're living proof of it. Everything about life changes. People say, I hope it's always this way. Well, it's not going to be. It's going to change. It's going to change. And that's why people, they strive to get what they want. And then when they get it, guess what? It's going to change. Well, how do you know that? Because that's life. Seasons. Seasons. That's our entire life. It's seasons. One season after another. So he states here, for everything there is a season. So it reveals that life is a process. And in that process may be the valley of the shadow of death. It tells us that life consists of alterations. Life consists of modifications, revealing that life consists of a variety of change and transition. And change at times can be drastic, as we see here in Ecclesiastes, as we see also in Psalm 23, to the valley of the shadow of death. Change can be sudden. You can see some change coming. You can see it coming. You know it's coming. But there's some change you don't expect. Some change can be sudden. And that's going to happen to everyone if you live long enough. So whatever the season or time of life, it can change and it will change. It can and it will change. Every season in this life will end. Every season. Just as the natural seasons of earth bring change. They bring change in weather. They bring change in appearance. Things don't look the same in the winter as they do the summer. Things don't look the same as the summer as they do in the fall. Things look different. And so it is with the changes of life. Things appear different. But this remains the same. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. All those things remain the same. There's a change in dangers. In July, I have no danger of stepping outside and slipping on ice. That's not a danger. I don't have a danger of driving my car into a snowbank. That danger doesn't exist in that season. I don't have much of a danger of getting sunstroke in January or heat stroke. It's not going to happen. So again, each season brings different dangers. Each change brings different dangers. Each change brings different obstacles. Also brings different opportunities. If you like to ski, snow ski, you don't do that in July. Winter brings that opportunity. If you like to sit out on a boat, you're probably not going to have that opportunity in January. But come July, you have that opportunity. So opportunities. Every season has its opportunity. We lose sight of that because all we see is the shadow of death. People feel different in the seasons. You don't feel the same as you do in the summer and winter. You feel different. You have different emotions in different seasons. And so it is with life. Life is made up of seasons. Though the seasons of life are not as consistent as the seasons of the weather. It's not the same. Change can occur at any time in our families. We've all experienced that. It can be birth, it can be death. It could be many other things. But change can occur at any time in our families. Change can occur at any time in our health. You can be healthy. 10 minutes from now, you'll be in the emergency room. You can be sick. 10 minutes from now, you can be better. Change happens. Careers change. Finances can change. You hear people say, well, I'm set for life. No, you're not. You may think you are. But all that can change. Well, I don't see it. It can change. Relationships change. Our overall circumstances change. Our hearts change. Our minds change. Everything is in a constant flux of change. But in spite of it all, yea, though. Yea, though. Whatever, and what's on the other side of though is the changes. Yea, though. I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. This is our passing through time. That's how we need to view life in this world. A passing through. A passing through the changes of life and all that entails. And some change entails much more than other change. But there's coming a never-ending, never-changing season. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But in the meantime, we are going to go through some seasons. And you realize, people, well, never mind, it's getting past time. People say, they walk outside and the weather, only in Illinois, only in Michigan. No. Those aren't the only two places. Sharon and I walked out of the grocery store one time up in Michigan. It was in January. And it was a blizzard, and a guy walked out and goes, only in Michigan. Buddy, it happens every year. And no, it's not only in Michigan that it snows in January. It happens at a lot of places. But again, there's coming a day, never-changing season. The seasons of life, we can experience them all in a matter of seconds. In a matter of minutes, we can experience them all. You can experience birth and death at the same time. You may be experiencing the birth of one coming into life and at the same time one going out. You can experience both those seasons in the same time, in the same moment. And that's true all through our life. We have these seasons, but we're just passing through. And yea, though, whatever the season is, remember where we're headed. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song. Let's all stand and Dave will lead us in singing.